A photograph sits in a collection, its edges yellowed and fragile. The date inscribed on the back reads simply June 1910. Inside the frame, a wedding party stands frozen in time. A couple, their witnesses, all dressed in the formal attire of the era. Their faces are solemn, their postures rigid, exactly as one would expect from a photograph of that age. But something is wrong. Something in the periphery demands attention. Beyond the window behind them, through the glass that should show nothing more than a peaceful summer day, there is chaos. This is not a story about ghosts or time travelers. This is a story about a single moment captured on film. A moment that should not exist as it does. A moment that 3 researchers would spend months trying to understand. The photograph arrived at Dr. C. Elias Thorne's laboratory in an unmarked envelope, accompanied only by a brief note asking if he could explain what was happening outside the window. Dr. Thorne, a specialist in historical image analysis and optical physics, had seen countless photographs from the early 20th century. He had examined fakes, identified authentic treasures, and debunked more than his share of supposed mysteries. But this one made him pause. The wedding party inside the home appears entirely ordinary. The bride wears a high-necked dress with elaborate lacework. The groom stands beside her in a dark suit, his hand resting formally at his side. 2 witnesses flank them, their expressions appropriately serious for the occasion. The interior of the room is typical of a modest but respectable home from 1910. Dark wood furniture, floral wallpaper, a sense of careful middle-class propriety. Everything inside the photograph speaks to order, to ceremony, to the careful preservation of an important moment, but the window tells a different story entirely. Dr. Thorne brought the photograph to Eleanor Vance, an archivist who specialized in the authentication of early 20th century documents and photographs. Eleanor had spent decades handling fragile paper, learning to read the stories that materials themselves could tell. She examined the photograph under magnification, tested the paper composition, analyzed the chemical signatures of the developing process. Her verdict was unambiguous. The photograph was authentic. The paper dated to between 1905 and 1915. The photographic chemicals matched those commonly used in that era. The aging patterns were consistent with genuine deterioration over more than a century. This was not a modern forgery. This was not a digital manipulation. This photograph was exactly what it appeared to be, a genuine image from June 1910. But if the photograph was real, then what was happening outside that window? Dr. Thorne magnified the section of the image showing the view through the glass. The first thing that became apparent was motion. Despite the long exposure times required by cameras of that era, which typically rendered everything as frozen and still, the scene outside the window showed clear evidence of movement. Blurred streaks suggested objects in rapid motion. Dark shapes that might have been debris or dust filled the air. The visible portions of the street beyond were obscured by what appeared to be a dense cloud of particulate matter, and there, in the upper left quadrant of the window's view, was the detail that would become the focus of months of investigation. A distinct, angular shadow that did not match anything else in the chaotic scene. Professor Silas Green joined the investigation next. As a botanist with a specialty in dendrology and seasonal plant identification, Professor Green seemed an unusual choice for analyzing a photograph. But Dr. Thorne had called him for a specific reason. In the immediate foreground of the window view, just visible at the bottom edge of the glass, were branches from a tree close to the house. Professor Green studied these branches carefully. His conclusion added another layer to the mystery. The branches showed full foliage. The leaves were large, mature, and healthy. The density and development of the leaf cover indicated late spring or summer growth. In botanical terms, this was entirely consistent with the June dating inscribed on the photograph's back. Whatever was happening outside that window had happened during a time of year when trees were in full leaf. This created an immediate problem. The chaos visible through the window looked nothing like a typical June day. Dr. Thorne began to catalog the possibilities. Could this be a severe thunderstorm? Tornado damage? Some kind of industrial accident? He examined the motion patterns in the blurred areas of the image. The debris appeared to be moving horizontally, driven by strong wind or perhaps a blast wave. The density of the particulate matter suggested either a dust storm or the aftermath of a structural collapse, but neither explanation fit comfortably with the season or with the wedding party's apparent calm. Dr. Thorne reached out to Dr. Ingrid Home, a seismologist who maintained extensive databases of historical natural disasters. If the chaos outside the window had been caused by an earthquake, a major storm, or any other documented natural event, Dr. Home would be able to find a record of it. She searched through archives of historical weather data, seismic records, and newspaper accounts from June 1910. She focused her search on regions where the architectural style visible in the photograph was common. Her findings were frustrating in their emptiness. There were no major recorded earthquakes in any likely location during June 1910. No hurricanes, no tornadoes of sufficient magnitude to create the level of destruction visible in the photograph. There were minor weather events, of course, but nothing that matched what the image showed. The absence of historical records created a new mystery. If something catastrophic enough to fill the air with debris and cause visible structural damage had occurred, why was there no documentation of it? Even in 1910, significant disasters were reported in newspapers, recorded in municipal records, and remembered in local histories. Yet the research team could find nothing. Dr. Thorne turned his attention back to the photograph itself, focusing on the human subjects. The wedding party stood in their formal poses, facing the camera. Their expressions were serious but not frightened. Their postures showed no signs of alarm or distress. They appeared to be completely unaware of or unconcerned by whatever was happening just yards away from them, visible through the window at their backs. This seemed impossible. How could 4 people remain so composed while chaos erupted outside? But then Dr. Thorne noticed something. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was there. The groom's eyes. While the others in the party stared directly at the camera, the groom's gaze was slightly off-center. His eyes were directed not quite at the lens, but toward something to the side, toward the window. The deviation was minimal, perhaps only a few degrees, but in the context of the rigid formality of the rest of the image, it stood out. The groom knew something was happening outside. He was aware of it. Yet he remained still, committed to the photograph, refusing to break the formality of the moment. This observation led to a new theory. Perhaps the chaos outside the window was not happening at the exact moment the photograph was taken. Perhaps it was a reflection of something that had already occurred or was in the process of being cleaned up. Perhaps the wedding party was calm because the immediate danger had passed. But this theory had problems. The motion blur in the debris suggested active movement at the time of exposure. The density of the particulate matter in the air suggested an ongoing event, not an aftermath. Eleanor Vance proposed a different possibility. She had been researching the photographer whose name was stamped faintly on the back of the print, Theodore Finch. Theodore Finch had operated a modest photography studio in the early years of the 20th century. Eleanor found references to him in local business directories and a few surviving examples of his work in historical archives. What she discovered was intriguing. Theodore Finch had been known for experimental techniques. He had written letters to photography journals describing his experiments with specialized lens filters and unusual developing methods. He had been particularly interested in creating dramatic effects, in adding what he called atmospheric tension to his images. Could the chaos outside the window be an intentional photographic effect? Could Theodore Finch have used some kind of filter or double exposure technique to create the appearance of disaster where none existed? Eleanor presented this theory to Dr. Thorne. It would explain the absence of historical records. It would explain the wedding party's composure. It would solve the central mystery of the photograph. Dr. Thorne was skeptical. He returned to his laboratory and subjected the photograph to spectral analysis, examining how light had interacted with the photographic emulsion in different areas of the image. The results were definitive. The chaos visible through the window showed no signs of double exposure. The light values were consistent with a single exposure of a real scene. More importantly, the angular shadow in the upper left of the window view, the detail that had first caught his attention, showed characteristics that could not be explained by any lens filter technique known to have existed in 1910. The shadow had depth. It had structural integrity. It was not an optical illusion or a photographic trick. It was a real object, captured by the camera as it existed in the physical world. Dr. Thorne magnified the shadow as much as the resolution of the original photograph would allow. The more he studied it, the more convinced he became that it was part of a structure, not a natural formation, not debris, but something built. The angles were too regular. The shadow patterns suggested a rigid framework. He measured the proportions and compared them to architectural elements common in the early 20th century. The shadow matched the dimensions of industrial structural components: steel beams, support columns, the kind of framework used in factories or large municipal buildings. A new theory began to take shape. What if the chaos outside the window was not a natural disaster, but an industrial accident? What if a building had collapsed near the wedding party's home? In 1910, industrial construction was rapidly expanding. Factories, warehouses, and large commercial buildings were being erected in cities and towns across the country. Many of these structures were built quickly, sometimes with inadequate attention to safety. Structural failures, while not common enough to make national news, occurred with disturbing regularity. A collapse of a large building would create exactly the kind of scene visible in the photograph: a cloud of dust and debris, horizontal motion as the structure fell, and the angular shadows of twisted framework. But this theory created its own questions. If a building had collapsed near enough to be visible from the wedding party's window, why did local records not mention it? Dr. Sear Holm returned to her historical research, this time focusing not on natural disasters but on industrial accidents. She searched through newspaper archives from likely geographical regions, looking for any mention of structural collapses, factory accidents, or building failures in June 1910. She found several incidents in various locations, but none that could be definitively connected to the photograph. However, she did make one important discovery. In the early 20th century, not all industrial accidents were widely reported. Minor collapses that resulted in no fatalities, or that occurred in less populated areas, often went unreported beyond local word of mouth. The absence of records did not prove that nothing had happened. It only proved that if something had happened, it had not been considered significant enough to document thoroughly. Dr. Thorne assembled his findings. The photograph was authentic, taken in June 1910. The chaos outside the window was real, not a photographic trick. The angular shadow was most likely part of a collapsed structure. The wedding party had been aware of the event, as evidenced by the groom's diverted gaze, but had chosen to continue with their photograph anyway. This last point became the key to understanding the entire image. Professor Green, who had been quietly reviewing all of the research, offered a perspective that none of the others had considered. In 1910, he pointed out, the pace of industrial change was extraordinarily rapid. People living through that era experienced more technological and social transformation in a single decade than previous generations had experienced in entire lifetimes. Factories rose and fell. Buildings were constructed and demolished. Accidents happened. For people living in that world, especially those in industrial areas, the sight of a structural collapse might have been alarming but not entirely shocking. It would have been a tragedy, certainly, but one of many that occurred in that age of rapid, sometimes reckless progress. Viewed through this lens, the photograph took on a different meaning. The wedding party's decision to continue with their formal portrait, even as a building collapsed visible through their window, was not evidence of callousness or ignorance. It was evidence of something else entirely, a determination to preserve a moment of personal significance against a backdrop of impersonal chaos. The wedding was important to them. It was their moment, their commitment, their future. The collapse outside, tragic as it might have been, belonged to a different narrative, one that existed beyond the frame of their personal story. Dr. Thorne considered this interpretation. It fit the evidence. It explained the behavioral paradox of the composed wedding party and the chaotic exterior. But it also revealed something uncomfortable about the photograph and about the era it came from. The image captured not just a wedding and not just a disaster, but the intersection of private life and public catastrophe. It showed how people could maintain the rituals of personal life even as the larger world fell apart around them. It demonstrated the human capacity for selective attention, for focusing on what could be controlled while acknowledging but not dwelling on what could not. The angular shadow in the upper left of the window remained the most concrete piece of evidence. Dr. Thorne's analysis suggested it was part of a large structural framework, most likely from a commercial or industrial building. The position and angle indicated the structure had been close to the wedding party's home, probably within a block or two. The motion blur in the debris field suggested the collapse had happened either during the photograph's exposure or immediately before it, with dust and debris still settling. The wedding party's home had been close enough to witness the event but far enough away to be safe from immediate danger. Eleanor Vance found one final piece of evidence that supported this theory. In her research on Theodore Finch, she discovered that his studio had been located in a town that experienced significant industrial growth between 1905 and 1915. Several factories had been built during that period. One reference she found, in a letter from a local resident to a distant relative, mentioned a mill building that had come down during construction in the summer of 1910. The letter did not provide an exact date or extensive details, but it confirmed that at least one structural collapse had occurred in the right place at approximately the right time. The research team never found definitive proof of exactly which building had collapsed or precisely when. The historical record was too sparse, too incomplete, but the evidence they had assembled painted a coherent picture. On a June day in 1910, a wedding party gathered for a formal photograph in a home in an industrial town. At the same time, visible through their window, a building under construction, or perhaps an older structure weakened by time, experienced a catastrophic failure. The collapse sent debris and dust into the air. The wedding party, aware of the event but focused on their own important moment, chose to proceed with their photograph. Theodore Finch, their photographer, captured the image. 4 people in formal dress marking the beginning of a marriage, while behind them, through the window, the physical world came apart. The photograph endures not because it shows a wedding or because it documents a disaster, but because it captures the tension between those two realities. It shows how people navigated an age of rapid change and frequent tragedy. It demonstrates the determination to preserve personal meaning even when the larger context suggested instability and danger. The wedding party's composure, which initially seemed mysterious or impossible, becomes understandable as an act of defiance against chaos, a refusal to let external circumstances override personal significance. Dr. Thorne kept a copy of the photograph on his laboratory wall. He would occasionally stop and study it, looking at the wedding party's faces, at the groom's slightly diverted eyes, at the chaos visible through the window. The true mystery of the image, he eventually concluded, was not what had happened outside the window. The true mystery was what had been ignored. In choosing to focus on their wedding rather than on the collapse, the people in the photograph had made a statement about what mattered to them. They had drawn a line between their private world and the public disaster. They had insisted on the importance of their moment, even as the world around them demonstrated its fragility. The photograph asks viewers to consider what they would do in a similar situation. Would they stop the ceremony? Would they rush to help? Would they abandon their personal moment in favor of responding to the larger crisis? Or would they, like the wedding party in the image, choose to preserve their own significant moment, to complete their ritual, to mark their commitment despite the chaos? There is no simple answer to these questions, which is perhaps why the photograph remains so compelling more than a century after it was taken. The research team published their findings in a modest academic journal. The paper generated some interest among specialists in historical photography and industrial history, but it never became widely known. The photograph itself remained in Eleanor Vance's archive, available for study but rarely requested. Yet, for those who took the time to examine it closely, to understand the layers of context and interpretation that Dr. Thorne and his colleagues had assembled, the image remained powerful. It captured a June day in 1910. It showed a wedding and a collapse. It demonstrated how people made choices about attention and priority in an age when the world changed rapidly and not always for the better. The date on the back, June 1910, was accurate. The chaos outside the window was real, and the wedding party's decision to look forward, to focus on their future together rather than on the disaster behind them, was the most human element of all. The photograph does not resolve the tension between personal significance and public catastrophe. It simply presents both, frozen in silver and paper, preserved across decades, asking each viewer to decide what they see and what it means.